Should I just bring everybody up? Okay. If Shanondora, Jaskaran, and Sam would like to come up. So I will transition here to panel 1. What is sustainability justice and who decides? So just to introduce this panel, environmental justice has experienced exponential growth over the last 2 decades and is now a keystone concept driving the broader sustainability movement. Simultaneously representing a dynamic social movement, field of scholarship, and framework for understanding our fast-changing world, environmental justice has moved beyond its initial focus on the inequitable distribution of environmental burdens to incorporate a range of pressing social and ecological issues. The rapid expansion of environmental justice has raised important questions about how it should be defined, by whom, and for what purpose. In response, this panel explores how different academic disciplines, specifically anthropology, political theory, and social work, think about and critique environmental justice concepts, incorporate them into their work, and understand their utility in generating equitable socio-ecological change. While their work differs substantially in terms of research subject and context, I find that they have a similar understanding of the way in which power, recognition, and knowledge inform environmental justice concepts and approaches. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Jaskaran Dillon. Dr. Dillon is a first-generation anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Cree territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Committed to the tenets of public intellectualism, her scholarship is intimately connected to and informed by on-the-ground advocacy and direct action. Her work spans the fields of settler colonialism, anthropology of the state, anti-racist and Indigenous feminism, youth studies, colonial violence, political ecology, and critical Indigenous studies, and has been published in The Guardian, Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Formations, Environment and Society, Social Texts, and Decolonization, among other venues. Her first book, Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization, and the Politics of Intervention, provides a critical ethnographic account of state interventions in the lives of urban Indigenous youth. Her new research focuses on developing an anti-colonial critique of the environmental justice movement by examining Indigenous political movements working against extractivism, including the resistance of Standing Rock. She is a guest editor of a special issue of Environment and Society that foregrounds Indigenous resistance to and theorizing of climate change, and is co-editor along with Nick Estes of Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from No Dapple Movement. Dr. Dillon is an associate professor of global studies and anthropology at the New School and a founding member of the New York Stands with Standing Rock collective. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Dillon.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here today and to the organizing committee for inviting me to be part of this Congress. I think it's incredibly timely, as we've already heard. We don't have the luxury of sitting back. We don't have the luxury of retreat, and we certainly don't have the luxury of staying silent. So it's an honor to be here. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself so you have a sense of how I actually came to work on issues of climate change and environmental justice. So I have a long history of doing work in solidarity with Indigenous communities and nations that started with where I grew up on Cree territory and homelands in Saskatchewan. And primarily my work was centered on trying to document some of the forms of colonial state violence that was consistently being enacted against Indigenous communities, often against the backdrop of erasure and elimination strategies of various kinds. And through that work, I became acquainted with some of the Indigenous resistance movements that were centered on the tar sands industrial development project that is right outside of Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada, which is the largest industrial development project on the planet. And I started sort of watching and listening to how young people were organizing around this, how people were articulating a sense of environmental politics, which was quite different from what I was encountering in the mainstream environmental movement. So this, coupled with my growing interest in climate change, obviously, because it's something that those of us that care about the world and think about political questions are confronted with all the time, led me down the road of developing this work. So there's always a story behind how people end up where they are and working and focusing on what they focus on. I also have a daughter who is a junior at Brown who became quite politicized when she was in her teens, starting at 13, and became really interested in the environmental movement and started organizing young people in Philadelphia, where we live. And I started to become concerned a little bit about how her vernacular and sensibility about climate change was actually being informed through the dominant environmental movement, right? Which includes a largely uncritical and homogenizing representation of the Anthropocene, which leaves out the whole narrative of how we've arrived here in the first place. So that, coupled with my interest, has really, prompted me to begin work in this area. So before I get started today, I just want to echo what my comrades have already said about the current moment, a little bit about the current moment that we're in. And I feel like this is something we're going to be hearing consistently throughout the next day and a half, but I think it warrants remembering that this is a very specific historical moment and context under which all of these presentations are taking place. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists for being here today and sharing the stage with me. So we are living in a time when the world is teetering on the precipice of climate change, on a planet where millions of people are dispossessed and live in conditions of severe deprivation, a planet where fascism and authoritarianism are on the rise, where access to water is becoming increasingly precarious, and at the same time, massive floods are expected to displace millions of people, where climate change deniers hold the seats of political power in countries all over the world. Just earlier this morning, far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, blamed the international media and environmental organizations for spreading quote-unquote lies about the fires that are ravaging the Amazon rainforest during a nationalist speech that opened the 2019 United Nations General Assembly. It's a time where the world's biodiversity is increasingly threatened. And in case you don't know this, Indigenous people protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. When the lungs of the Earth are burning, species extinction is growing, and glaciers are melting far quicker than climate scientists ever predicted. The predictions in India, and I'll just use this because this is where my family comes from, and the predictions are so devastating there, are a glaring case in point. According to a recent report issued by an Indian think tank, 21 Indian cities, including Delhi, Chennai, and Hyderabad, are expected to run out of groundwater by 2020. And 40% of India's population will have no access to drinking water by 2030. That's a decade from now. A billion people live in India, so you can imagine how many people that is. And of course, this is just one example of many across the globe. The struggle against climate change and for environmental justice is, at a fundamental level, an internationalist project. It's also important to remember that what I offer here today is deeply informed by frameworks that attempt to understand questions of climate justice as central to the dynamics of settler colonialism and US imperialism, although what I will speak today is largely situated within the US context. And again, just as a reminder, the United States has contributed more to the problem of excess carbon dioxide than any other country on the planet. According to World Watch Institute, the United States, with less than 5% of the global population, uses about a quarter of the world's fossil fuel resources, burning up nearly 25% of the coal, 26% of the oil, and 27% of the world's natural gas. The US Department of Defense is both the country's and the world's largest polluter. In fact, the US military bases rank as some of the most polluted places in the world. So just to keep that in mind about where we're situated here in the United States, having this conversation and the relationship between this settler colony with the crisis, the climate crisis. So let me begin by offering a few questions that help to guide my work in my presentation today. So part of what I'm interested in understanding is, what are the problematics of Indigenous participation within the climate justice movement? How might climate justice work to reinscribe colonial practices by foregrounding the interests of white settlers? And what can we learn from Indigenous-led resistance to climate change and environmental devastation? So with these questions in mind, keep these questions in mind as I move through the following points. First, in the wake of a planet-wide movement riddled with idioms about saving our home, where the ground is fast shifting and the fate of humanity's collective future is at stake, there's been a tidal wave of interest in Indigenous knowledges about the land, water, and sky, a desire to capture and store the intergenerational wisdom that speaks to the unpredictable path lying ahead. Littered throughout academic writing, climate justice protests, and climate science reports are a host of references to the importance of harnessing Indigenous knowledge systems in the service of global sustainability. As a case in point, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Summary Report for 2014 asserts, quote, Indigenous, local, and traditional knowledge systems and practices, including Indigenous peoples' holistic view of community and environment, are a major resource for adapting to climate change, but these have not been used consistently in existing adaptation efforts. Integrating such forms of knowledge with existing practices increases the effectiveness of adaptation, end quote. More recently, Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama issued a joint statement on climate, energy, and Arctic leadership, which makes an explicit reference to Indigenous science and traditional knowledge by stating that, quote, Canada and the United States are committed to collaborating with Indigenous and Arctic government leaders and communities and to respectfully include Indigenous science and traditional knowledge into decision-making, end quote. Particularly noteworthy within both of these frames is the vernacular of integration and inclusion that underlies the broader impetus for seeking Indigenous knowledge. What I mean by this is, while at first glance we might consider these inclusionary politics to be a move in the right direction, the integration of Indigenous knowledge as something to be used in the interests of global recovery from climate crisis, I believe it merits a deeper and more nuanced reading. Pushing us to consider the problematics associated with state-driven discovery of Indigenous knowledge, Deborah McGregor highlights the way that Indigenous knowledge of the environment is derived through a living process that stems from Indigenous relationships to creation and is generated through a body of ancient thought, experience, and action. It is generated by the things that one does, rather than something that one simply knows. She argues, quote, the natural world, environment, or creation are an essential part of the conception of Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is not just a Indigenous knowledge is not just knowledge per se, it is the lives lived by people and their particular relationship with creation, end quote. From Gregor's perspective, Indigenous knowledge is not a noun. It is not a commodity or a product that can be drawn upon as a last-ditch effort to be integrated into a battalion of adaptive solutions to save us all. To acquire this knowledge means entirely shifting our current patterns of living in the everyday. It is cumulative and dynamic, adaptive and spiritual, and is produced in a collective process that is fundamentally centered on the way that one relates. So this is getting at some of the epistemological orientations to the world around us, right? How we think about our relationship to what we consider nature, our relationship to humans and other than humans. We might ask then, whose interests are being served when the settler state and other states around the world attempt to extract and distill bits and pieces of Indigenous knowledge to work in the service of climate recovery? What is lost in this process of integration when it is not occurring in conjunction with moves towards decolonization that center the question of colonization and its impacts, when there is not a clear intention to understand how the colonial spatial restructuring of the land has affected Indigenous relationships to the land? How might this knowledge be exploited to maintain Canada and the United States, to borrow Eileen Morton Robinson's phrase, as white possessions? An appropriation of Indigenous knowledge which omits any explicit commitment to the radical political reordering of the materials and power that are required to save the planet will simply be more of the same. Second, Indigenous peoples often factor into debates about climate change in relation to questions of impact on frontline communities and related issues associated with the maintenance of traditional lifestyle. They are showcased, in other words, in terms of the most immediate and most visible harm occurring as a result of runaway fossil fuel extraction and capitalist development. While this is undoubtedly important to consider, and localized resistance efforts around environmental destruction should, of course, be waged, I'm concerned that this representation alone runs the risk of obscuring the historical and political context in which these extractive projects have taken flight in the first place, and reduces the far-reaching power of colonialism to an isolated location where the effects can be most visibly seen. Kyle White succinctly captures this fundamental point when he says, quote, "Anthropogenic human-caused climate change is an intensification of environmental change imposed on Indigenous peoples by colonialism," end quote. In Wastelanding, Legacies of Uranium Mining in Navajo Country, Tracy Voiles similarly insists, quote, "Although scholars of environmental justice studies most often focus on contemporary, post-1982 examples of environmental injustice, Native Americans are quick to note that the tendencies of those in power to exert their power by manipulating resources and degrading the natural environment is something with which colonized people are all too familiar. In fact, the most workable date for the founding of the Native environmental justice movement is 1492, end quote. The temporal sensibilities that animate liberal environmentalists' concerns are distinct from the sense of time experienced by Indigenous peoples who have had to survive environmental catastrophe since the initiation of the colonial project. From the vantage point of Indigenous resistance, the environmental crisis is coexistive with the time of colonialism. Resistance efforts to halt the contamination and toxicity from industrial projects, then, must be simultaneously linked to a long-term strategy of advancing Indigenous liberation and the resurgence of Indigenous governance systems that demand a different relationality to the land, water, and air. Cleaning up toxic mess at one site will not stop the colonial settler state from finding another one down the road, where the power to resist and organize may be less viable. The settler colonies of the United States and Canada have always been preoccupied with questions of natural resources, the desire for them, the management of them, and the ability to translate them into profit. Coupled with the consistent portrayal of frontline damage is also an invocation of Indigenous rights as a potential strategic avenue to curb industrial development, and this can be found throughout the climate justice movement, where the language of protecting the commons reigns. Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, for example, contains numerous references to the potential utility of Indigenous legal rights as a way to safeguard what she calls, quote, "the unexploded carbon bombs that lie beneath the land and waters to which Indigenous peoples have legitimate claims." Once again, while I certainly see merit in Klein's call to mobilize alongside frontline Indigenous communities to halt extraction, I am suspect of the instrumental framing of Indigenous rights as a way to protect us all against the whims of settler colonial state agents, when both settler publics in the United States and Canada have done little to address the ongoing dispossession and elimination of Indigenous people, a politics of elimination that made it possible for this kind of development to unfold in the first place, I might add. Moreover, this kind of strategic instrumentalism does not appear to be linked to the broader goals of decolonization that would require a deliberate undoing of the settler state. This is not to say that Indigenous communities' use of legal mechanisms are not important and useful in retelling the story of colonialism and its links with environmental devastation. Counter-narratives about Indigenous relations to the land and the ways that colonial violence operated to separate them from it must be told, and one way where this counterscript can be written is in the realm of legal rights. Yet it is imperative that we are also careful about identifying the limits of these forms of political contestation, and also be clear about when legal rights become utilized instrumentally to work in the service of colonizing governments. My third and final point revolves around critiques of capitalism that are found throughout the climate justice movement and presented clearly in Klein's This Changes Everything and Jason Moore's Capitalism in the Web of Life. And I choose these two books because when I did a scan of environmental studies curriculum, these books were the ones that were most commonly taught in environmental studies classes, which had almost no Indigenous scholars or writers in any of the classes, or any other people of color for that matter, in the majority of the curriculum. Both of these books call for a civilization wake-up call that forces us to contend with our current political paradigm that, as Klein puts it, is based on our socially constructed right to extract ever more without ever facing consequences, our capacity to bend complex natural systems to our will. Moore pushes this slightly further by referring to capitalism as more than an economic and social system. Instead, he describes capitalism as a way of organizing nature based on a nature-society dualism that places humans outside of nature. As far as critiques of the economic ordering of our world go in light of climate justice, both of these works make a substantial contribution. but where they fall short is making an explicit and sustained link among capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. Both of these works, in other words, have sidelined the role that colonialism and imperialism play in the proliferation of the kind of capitalism that has wreaked havoc on the planet as we know it. In Red Skin, White Masks, Glenn Coulthard adapts Marx's theory of primitive accumulation to paint a picture of capitalism through the colonial relation itself, and that is again distinct, thereby elevating the injustice of colonial dispossession as key to capitalist accumulation in the settler state of Canada. In the opening pages, Coulthard writes, quote, "I believe that reestablishing the colonial relation of dispossession as a co-foundational feature of our understanding of and critical engagement with capitalism opens up the possibility of developing a more ecologically attentive critique of colonial capitalist accumulation, especially if this engagement takes its cue from the grounded normativity of indigenous modalities of place-based resistance and criticism," end quote. Colonial systems of capitalist accumulation directly tied to the invention of private property open the floodgates for natural resources to be transported from oil and gas fields, refineries, lumber mills, mining operations, and hydroelectric facilities located on the dispossessed lands of Indigenous nations to international markets. Indeed, Kyle White reminds us that in the US settler context, settler colonial laws, policies, and programs are both a significant factor in opening up Indigenous territories for carbon-intensive economic activities, and at the same time, a significant factor in why Indigenous peoples face heightened climate risks. So let me quickly give you an example before I close out. One of the places where this Indigenous resistance to colonial capitalist accumulation was witnessed most visibly was at Standing Rock. So I'm going to skip a little bit so I save time and just go to May 2017, when those of us that were engaged in the struggle would learn that counterterrorism tactics were used at Standing Rock to undertake massively intrusive and aggressive surveillance against water protectors. Through an investigation led by the Intercept, it was revealed that police across at least 5 states were working in close collaboration with the international mercenary security firm known as Tiger Swan to spearhead a multifaceted response to the growing resistance at Standing Rock. Tiger Swan had first originated as a US military and State Department contractor helping to execute the global war on terror, and now had been sequestered by the Fortune 500 company, oil and gas company, Energy Transfer Partners, to respond to the Indigenous-led movement that sought to stop the project. Although based in Apex, North Carolina, Tiger Swan has an estimated 350 employees and maintains offices in Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, India, Latin America, and Japan. The methods of deliberate political suppression used by Tiger Swan took the form of water cannons, drones, army tankers, rubber bullets, tear gas, attack dogs, LRAD sound devices, the deployment of snipers, physical road blockades in multiple locations, aerial surveillance and radio eavesdropping, infiltration of camps and activist circles with undercover agents, and the reaping of information from social media, all of which fed directly into the FBI and local police tactics of violent containment. The journalists also discovered that Tiger Swan was keeping a person of interest list as well as other databases that included identifying information, such as photographs and license plate numbers for people that were active in the resistance, and that employees assigned to the case from Tiger Swan consistently referred to the resistance at Standing Rock as, quote, an ideological-driven insurgency with a strong religious component, and compared the anti-pipeline water protectors to jihadist fighters. So in the case of Standing Rock, Indigenous peoples became positioned as a threat to national security because they were blockading a corporation that was working in partnership with a government, a federal government, blocking their ability to participate in racialized capitalist accumulation. And we can see a very similar thing happening in Brazil right now when you listen to the rhetoric around economic security and the burning of the Amazon, the rainforest. And furthermore, when we resurrect the importance of treaty relations, we learn that the Sioux Nation never ceded the 1851 treaty lands that lie at the center of their opposition to DAPL. So following in the footsteps of a long history of violence and encroachment on Indigenous homelands, Energy Transfer Partners, again, I will say with the support of the federal government, so this is sanctioned by the colonial federal government, violated this treaty relationship between the U.S. settler state and the Sioux Nation, even though treaties are regarded by the U.S. Constitution as the supreme laws of the land. So simply put, the criminalization of Indigenous resistance, which reinforces the power and sanctity of settler law, becomes glaringly apparent at Standing Rock. It also becomes clear that Indigenous-led resistance to climate change, not just here in the United States, but all over, is one of the most confrontational arms of the environmental justice movement as a whole. So thus, while I'm in political agreement with an anti-capitalist vision to counter environmental crisis, these movements need to be answerable to Indigenous peoples. Without such accountability, we will stifle our ability to reflect upon and shift our political strategies and tactics so that we're attentive to questions of colonial occupation and imperialism as much as we are attentive to extreme weather, rising sea levels, and global warming. Arundhati Roy writes in her conclusion to Walking with Our Comrades, quote, "If there is any hope for the world at all, it does not live in climate change conference rooms or in cities with tall buildings. It lives low down to the ground, with its arms around the people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains, and their rivers, because they know that the forests, the mountains, and the rivers protect them. The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination," end quote. Our Indigenous comrades all over the globe are leading the struggle against climate change and are showing us a pathway forward. Perhaps it's time we paid attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Dillon. I would now like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Samuel Bagg. Dr. Bagg is a prize postdoctoral fellow in politics at Nuffield College, Oxford. He received a PhD in political science from Duke University and served as a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University from 2017 to 2019. His work in democratic theory has appeared in the American Political Science Review, Perspectives on Politics, and several other scholarly venues. He is currently completing a book manuscript entitled The Dispersion of Power, A Critical Realist Theory of Democracy. Thanks.
Thanks, McKenzie. So I'm just gonna make this full screen here. Okay. And there's actually space up front. There's seats, so if people in the back are tired of sitting down, I would encourage you to come sit. Maybe, yeah, people raise their hands if there's a seat next to you. See, lots of seats. Okay. So I'll start out by saying that this isn't my normal kind of conference, not my normal audience. I'm a political theorist. So what I think about and write about on a day-to-day basis is usually at a pretty abstract level. Questions like, what does democracy mean and why should we want it? And so as you can imagine, it's easy to get lost in these abstractions. And I'm very grateful to McKenzie and to the rest of the team here for inviting me out so that I can learn more from the more grounded work that a lot of the folks here are doing. And I'm especially humbled and grateful to be on the stage with Jaskaran and Shanondora, who are both doing really impressive and important work. So hopefully I'll have something to add to the conversation as well. I guess you guys will have to be the judge of that. But what I think I might be able to offer is a kind of broader perspective that links concerns about environmental justice to other fields and context, other kinds of questions. So, as I understand it, there's a pretty well-established paradigm in this field that whenever there's a question of environmental justice raised by some development project or other, what's important is to make sure that the people who are affected by it have some kind of input. You want participation from a range of diverse stakeholders. That's what lies behind many of the procedures implemented by the National Environmental Policy Act, for instance. It's also the idea behind a lot of the procedures that are supposed to constrain settler states when they want to undertake projects that will affect indigenous groups. Now, I hope it won't shock anyone in this audience, at least, to observe that this paradigm has some limitations. And Jaskaran has, in particular, has done some really great work on this front. One way to see this is just to look at the results, right? Turns out we're still destroying the environment. The burdens still fall most heavily on the most marginalized people. So in that sense, this paradigm's been around for a while. Whatever it has achieved, it's not enough. But there's also a deeper reason for this, which is that any participatory process that we use will inevitably reflect the background power relations that are structuring society, which are often characterized by great asymmetries. These procedures are never neutral. They build in all sorts of assumptions about the goals and the boundaries of the discussion that's supposed to take place, about what rights people have, about what kinds of needs and values are even legible in that discussion. Okay, so hopefully this story is pretty familiar to most of you now, because from now on I'm basically going to assume that you agree with me. But nevertheless, even if we're in agreement about the limitations of this approach, I think it's important to understand the background and justification for it, to understand why these ideas might have seemed plausible or attractive, even to people with, let's say, reasonably good intentions. At the very least, getting clear on this, I think, can hopefully keep us from making the same kinds of mistakes in the future. And so what I want to do is to contextualize these developments within wider debates in my field of political theory over questions like, what is democracy? On the most common ways of thinking about it, democracy means some kind of collective self-rule. It means deciding together on equal terms. And it's desirable because we live in societies where we're always bound up with one another, so at least some of our decisions will affect other people. And not everyone can get their way in these conflicts every time. But what we can do, it seems, in these circumstances, is to make sure everyone has a say in those collective decisions. That's the idea. Now, the institution we most often associate with democracy, at least in the modern world, is voting, elections, right? And elections are, I think, deeply important. But you may have noticed that they're also a pretty coarse mechanism for achieving collective self-rule. It's just not very compelling to say that the decisions of government bureaucrats reflect my self-rule. They reflect my freedom. They reflect my agency. Just because I, voted for the guy who appointed the bosses of whoever was making those decisions, right? And of course, it's even less compelling if you didn't vote for the guy who appointed their bosses, right? So it's not surprising that many people have tried to find other ways of incorporating citizens' voices into political decision-making. If you look back at the course of democratic movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, the first really big movements are mostly about expanding the suffrage, but they don't stop there. Because after universal suffrage is achieved, people start to realize that it's not enough. And in response, many people have turned towards the related ideals of deliberation and participation as different ways, perhaps more direct ways, of realizing collective self-rule. You can understand why. If the problem is that people don't have enough of a say over the decisions that affect their lives, then it seems obvious that the solution is to give them more ways to participate, more opportunities to have a say. Moreover, it's not just any participation that seems valuable. You don't want people spreading lies or parroting demagogues, and you don't want people just screaming past each other either. You want people to participate in a reasonable, cooperative, reciprocal kind of way. You want them to deliberate. So for a lot of political theorists, at least, deliberation gets invested with all these great hopes because it represents the only way for reason and communication, for democracy, really. It represents the only way for the people to exert meaningful collective control over raw political power and material interests. Historically, in the world of democratic theory, some of the key contributions to these paradigms, to participatory and deliberative democracy, are being made in the 1970s and 1980s, around when things like environmental impact statements are starting to gain traction in the policy world. I wouldn't want to make strong causal claims here either way, but they're part of the same general atmosphere. And the general idea is to have dialogues that are oriented towards collaboration, compromise, and, if possible, consensus. Sounds pretty good. Well, as we've seen, and as I think we'll continue to see throughout the conference, I hope, that set of ideas has pretty important limitations when you apply it in practice. And in my view, the problem actually goes all the way back to the way we're thinking about democracy in terms of collective self-rule. Because I don't think that collective self-rule, in any meaningful sense, is really possible. I can't really go into all the reasons that I have for being skeptical about this ideal. That's a much longer argument, but I think we've already seen some cause for skepticism about this. For one, there's always going to be a multiplicity of power relations standing behind any supposedly collective decision, which may be reflected in things like how the agenda is set, what questions are up for debate, what forms of participation are allowed, what kinds of values are rendered legible in that discussion, the kinds of things I was talking about before in the context of environmental justice. And to the extent that we speak the language of collective self-rule, even just as an aspiration, I think that has the effect of concealing and erasing whatever inequalities and other power asymmetries will continue to structure those kinds of decisions. In practical terms, this means that it distracts us from more promising strategies and goals, which would take more direct aim at dismantling those power structures. And that suggests an alternative way of thinking about democracy, which I've advocated. And that is democracy simply as the dispersion of power. So the way I see it, democracy is not really about which procedures that we follow in making collective decisions, but rather the material conditions underlying whatever procedures we use. It's fundamentally about the distribution of social and economic power. Accepting this model doesn't require that we abandon deliberation and other collaborative forms of participation altogether. In some sense, we need those things, just like I think we need elections. But it requires that we stop valorizing any of these things as inherently valuable or free of suspicion, and instead supplement them with more oppositional forms of political action. This may not sound especially radical, and perhaps as a practical matter it isn't. Many people are already doing this on the ground, right? But as a way of thinking about what democracy means at its core, I think it is actually pretty radical because it turns democracy from a neutral procedure into a fighting creed. It means the people in the streets are the ones fighting for democracy, not the people telling them to go home and follow the rules. It means democracy is not a way of resolving disagreements among equals, but a pitched battle against entrenched sources of concentrated power. In this way, it responds to the world as we actually find it, with all its massive inequalities, structured as it is by settler colonialism and white supremacy. And it doesn't respond, it responds to that world instead of to the hypothetical world of equally situated individuals that theorists and policymakers tend to assume as a kind of baseline when they're thinking about what these institutions should look like. The problem with consensus-driven, collaborative models of politics is that they assume conflicts can be resolved through compromise or reconciliation if we just talk about them long enough. In that sense, they erase the existence of deep conflicts of interest and histories of domination that have often created those conflicts. They assume a set of broadly shared goals where it's just, the details that have to get worked out, when in fact these supposedly shared goals have often been imposed upon those who are invited to participate then in achieving them. Meanwhile, supposedly collaborative methods are used to blunt the force of contestation that would otherwise result, to essentially co-opt the opposition. Now, sometimes in politics, including in environmental policy and development and so on, sometimes there are actually broadly shared goals. And that's where I think participation and deliberation can do the most good. What needs to happen in these cases is you have to prevent the institutions from becoming captured by any particular interest. And participation and deliberation can help to do that by exposing various attempts at capture before they happen. But that's only possible when power relations are roughly equal already between the players involved, when there's not a history of domination and exploitation that gives some groups extraordinary advantages over others, where there's not massively conflicting interests at stake as a result. In cases like that, it's too late for participation. The institutions have already been captured effectively, and they're not going to serve, they're going to serve the interests of dominant groups, whether anyone intends it or not. To bring it down to earth just a little bit, in the context of environmental justice, what we're often talking about are massive corporations and their allies in government. And in many cases, the interests of these actors are inextricably linked with environmental destruction. Think of the groups behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, or the fossil fuel industry more broadly. These actors have a legal obligation to their shareholders to exploit the environment as intensively and cheaply as possible. So any attempt to participate in a supposedly collaborative process with them will always be a farce to some extent, a matter of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. To put it bluntly, groups in these kinds of circumstances, marginalized groups, don't need to be included in processes that are destroying their land, their culture, their livelihood. They need these processes to stop. And in a lot of these cases, that's not even on the table. So what do I think is the right approach here when it's already too late, when capture's already happened? I don't think participatory processes should just be abandoned altogether. As I've said, they can serve a beneficial purpose under conditions of relatively equal power and broadly shared interests. And even under conditions of massive asymmetry and conflict, they can serve as a foothold in the policymaking process around which organized oppositional movements can then mobilize. But the point is that in those circumstances, you always need organization and mobilization as well. When the power structure is so skewed, participatory institutions are bound to reflect dominant interests. The only solution then is to build countervailing power outside of those institutions, and that requires organizing. Well, I mean, it requires a lot of things, but the organizing, I think, is one of the most crucial. And I mean something fairly specific by that. I mean local, on-the-ground, face-to-face organizing, which can build and exert meaningful, collective, countervailing power. Not one-off protests or single-issue activism, which corporations and governments have learned to mostly ignore. To meaningfully alter the distribution of power, you need oppositional organizations that can sustain the fight over a long period, maintaining the ability of marginalized groups to act collectively, whether that's through strikes, walkouts, or other forms of direct action, sometimes also at the ballot box, but certainly not limited to it. Then perhaps, when the playing field has been leveled somewhat, at least, maybe then we can talk about deliberation and participation. But these should be understood as the outcome of democratization, as the goal, not the key democratizing process that's going to get us there. When deliberation and participation work as they're supposed to work, that's how we know we've arrived, in a sense, at a society that's at least tolerably egalitarian and democratic. But we shouldn't expect them to pave the roads to that promised land. Okay, so that's basically where I'm going to end for today, and I realize that's a bit of a cliffhanger, so I apologize. I've told you the way forward lies in organizing, but I haven't said much actually about what organizing actually entails, or how to do it, or how to apply the lessons to the complex tasks of environmental governance. And these are, of course, vital questions, which I plan to do some more work on going forward. But for now, I'm still relatively new to this topic, and there's a lot of folks who've been writing and thinking about this for much longer than I have, and of course, doing it on the ground as well. I'll just say I myself have been influenced especially by Jane McAlevey, who's a labor organizer who also has a PhD in sociology. She's written two very useful books, one that's more of a memoir and one that's more of an academic text called No Shortcuts. And the other person is Jeff Stout, whose book Blessed Are the Organized has been especially influential. So What I can say, though, just in closing, is that reframing the issues at a theoretical level, as I've tried to do in this talk, is, I think, an important part of the process. Even if it doesn't tell us exactly what to do, it can help us reorient ourselves, to see new possibilities, to focus on the things that matter most for democracy. Not the formal procedures, but the underlying distribution of power and the ability of marginalized groups in particular to exert countervailing collective power. So I hope that this little theoretical exercise, or interlude perhaps, has been useful for some of you as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sam. While Shanondora. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shanondora Billiot. Dr. Billiot of the United Homa Nation is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Illinois. Prior to assuming this role, she was a pre-doctoral Henry Rowe Cloud dissertation writing fellow at Yale University. She earned a PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis and holds a master's of social work from the University of Michigan, and both Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science degrees from Louisiana State University. Her research explores the intersection of health, environment, and culture among Indigenous peoples. This work is informed by her post-MSW practice experience in disaster recovery, community development, and national policy analysis. Her current research uses mixed methods to explore Indigenous-specific sensitivities to global environmental change exposure and pathways to health outcomes within vulnerable Indigenous populations, with the goal to develop mitigation and adaptation activities and inform communities, policymakers, and researchers.
Thank you, McKenzie. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, forgive me, for inviting me. And also, I want to thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. I really appreciate that. Yes, you did the full statement, so thank you. I also want to thank fellow panelists. Specifically, I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Dillon for talking about critical reflection of Indigenous environmental movement today, and for you, Dr. Bagg, about discussing agency and participation. So my presentation is going to take you from this very high abstract level to a very specific, specific community and my research with my community. Just use this instead. So as was a little bit mentioned, we know that globally 22% of the land surface is managed, used, or owned by approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples who live in about 70 countries and who constitute about 5,000 separate groupings. This means that approximately 6% of the world's population is maintaining about 80% of the world's biodiversity. And although Indigenous peoples around the world contribute the least to changes to their environment, they are disproportionately affected by these changes due to three main reasons. First, Indigenous peoples are in close proximity to the vulnerable ecosystems. There are social, spiritual, cultural, and traditional lifestyles that are deeply reliant on natural resources for subsistence and cultural practices. For example, many Indigenous peoples' creation stories are rooted within the physical space where they reside. And finally, due to historical events, Indigenous peoples as a group are disproportionately the poorest among their societies and have the greatest health disparities. While these changes are felt differently among Indigenous peoples, they are consistent around the globe. Therefore, it is critical to continue to document global environmental changes as seen from those who are in closest proximity to the environment, as well as to learn from specific ways of indigenous knowledge adaptation strategies. One such community who is experiencing extreme changes to the environment is example in Louisiana. So Louisiana has lost an average about 34 square miles of land per year for the last 50 years. Starting from 1932, when oil field came and dredged through the marshes, approximately 900 square miles have been lost. And this, for those of you who are like me and can't really imagine the space that well, it's like the size of the state of Delaware. And by 2050, it's estimated that an additional area about the size of the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area will be gone. Terrebonne Parish has lost 61% of that land from Louisiana, and it is one of the most vulnerable, socially and physically vulnerable parishes or counties in the United States. The government seat of Terrebonne Parish is Houma. It's named after my tribal community. And these communities along the Gulf Coast face high rates of poverty, low socioeconomic status, as well as limited access to public resources, such as healthcare, transportation, and transportation. So my study was a community-engaged approach. I did field work. This was for my dissertation, 2015 to May 2016. I don't know why it went out, but I'll continue. So it was funded fully by the Center for Social Development at Washington University, and I had full tribal approval, institutional review board approval from the Tribal Council of United Houma Nation and Washington University. I also was in partnership with the Tribal Council and the Dillon Community Center. So I fully believe that how we collect data and how we interact with communities is an expression of justice, and that the information that we receive from communities should be treated as information that is ceremonial. So in many indigenous communities, we say research is ceremony. And so participating with intention is essential. And so the Western way that we talk about this is that I did a non-probability sampling, but really what I did was I sat with communities making crab traps, and I sat on wharfs and marinas and talked to people. Many members, even though my uncle dragged me to the community and said, "This is my niece. You talk to her." My stepdad's like, "Now you be good." I still had to have a lot of layers of conversation to be able to earn trust from people. And so one such gentleman who owns this shed with the crab traps, he's the interlocutor, I guess you could say, of the bayou. So when people come in from shrimping or oystering, they stop and they gossip. So I found out that men are a bigger gossip than females in the community, and so they learn not only about the waterways and where the fish are flowing, but they are also learning about the politics and what's happening. And so being with the community and sitting there talking to them was more essential than distributing flyers or creating these really nice videos and things that we do for recruitment. Conducting my qualitative analysis, I did a phenomenological perspective, so from moving from open coding to crafting the essence of a shared experience. And the shared experience that I was asking was, how do environmental changes impact those living in the community? And so what I found was that across all aspects of looking at the environment, that discrimination was present it was the lens through which everything was viewed. So forgive me if I don't do the light right. Oh no, there's no light. So if you look at the map, starting from the top square, this is where we were at contact with Europeans. And through land laws of the French, the Spanish, and then the English, we were systematically moved down to the Gulf Coast. And so this displacement has created a shift over the centuries of the type of harvesting that we've come to know. In addition, the Terrebonne Parish and Lafourche Parish communities did not acknowledge that we were indigenous. In fact, if you go to the Congo Square in New Orleans, you'll see only one plaque that actually recognizes the fact that our community was there and having ceremony before it became a place of devastation and horror and violence. And also, I spoke to many tribal members who either received little education, formal education, or no formal education. This picture at the top is one of the tribal schools that were run by the missionaries. In fact, the first person, Homo person to graduate in Terrebonne Parish didn't happen until after 1968. Should I move?
No, it's the connection.
Okay. So they also had their ideas about how these environmental changes were caused. So as I mentioned, the oil fields dredged through the marsh, creating an open outlet for saltwater intrusion. Simultaneously, the Mississippi River dammed previous flows of where the river was, and would systematically, through flooding, provide sediment to enhance the ground. And then the other cause that people talked about for the extreme land loss was the increase in boat traffic, and not just that the boats are, that there's much more boats, there are many more boats, but that the vessels are huge and are required to be huge for reasons I'll try to get into, but that they have expanded bayous that I, as a 7-year-old, could swim across now, even after running or doing a triathlon, could not swim across. And so after looking at the data and working with my community advisory committee, in the center of the shared experience is the connection to land. And the connection to land has been lost because of these environmental changes. And it is cyclical, and it is between sociocultural events, the physical environmental changes, and impacts. So anthropogenic activities have caused these changes in the environment. One participant said the water's changed, this area's changed so much. The changes led to a loss of medicines and a loss of harvest. And they discussed how these changes in harvest have not only decreased in volume, but in size. One participant discussed the brown shrimp, how they don't grow as large, and they don't have as many. And not only are the harvesters catching less, but are that the size is not as much, but they're catching much less than in the past. And these changes have also led to impacts of health and livelihoods, where participants believe that their health is directly and indirectly impacted by the changes in the environment. And the harvest changes have happened slowly over time because of the decrease in the shrimp prices. For one example, so where somebody can catch a bushel of crabs or a tin of shrimp, they would get maybe $7 or $8 a pound, and now they get less than $2 a pound. And these changes of harvesting have led to a loss in cultural knowledge being passed and reiterated between generations. So many tribal members discuss that they didn't teach their children through writings. The teachings were passed through stories, and stories by doing. And so by harvesting the shrimp or going out and reading the land to gather oysters, or going into the forest to pick herbs, or by boiling the medicine or doing what you need to do to prepare the herbs to be medicine, was an action. But without these actions to be able to show their children and their future, or their generations, their future generations, then they're unable to share this knowledge, and it is being systematically lost. They talked about adaptation strategies and how they have these adaptation strategies that they have been practicing for a long time, but that they are no longer valued, and they are actually discouraged from Western laws. One such example is the burning of marsh. So after trappers would have their season of trapping, they would burn the marsh to solidify the ground and to get rid of the pest that would come in from the hot weather. This also reinforced the marsh, but now burning is not allowed, and so marshland is more susceptible to water, salt water. I'm pretty sure probably all heard of the government adaptation strategy of the extreme loss of land, which is the Ile de Jean Charles resettlement. And that is where the government of Louisiana partnered with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to relocate community members, residents from this one area called Ile de Jean Charles. The announcement, or the grant was procured, obtained, and the announcement was made by the state of Louisiana without ever once consulting with any resident from the community, and this caused for great consternation. And those of you who work down in the area know that there's still politics going on, but that the state is still planning on relocating, whether residents want to or not, to a more inland area. And so what this has led to is that there's a lack of awareness from governments on traditional ecological knowledge, and even an acceptance that there are different forms of knowledge, and that knowledge that is scientific is not above or a hierarchical way of knowing of indigenous or traditional knowledge. And that these environmental injustices today are re-traumatization of historical colonial efforts, as Dr. Dhillon talked about, and that they don't really understand government-to-government relationships or even honoring tribal sovereignty. I do have to say that the state of Louisiana in particular is becoming much more aware of tribal sovereignty. And for among members, there was a lack of awareness of these macro adaptation intervention activities that were going on, and a low willingness to participate due to the lack of trust that has happened over the generations. So this led me to ask to my current studies to ask to what extent is there generational or regional differences in perception of environmental changes? What elements of environmental changes have led to grief, emotional illness, or declining mental health? What elements of stigma among elders and men have led to reduced care for or treatment of health issues? And what is the role of culture in understanding and responding to environmental changes? So in phase one, when I first got to University of Illinois, I applied for and received the Campus Research Board grants, thank you very much. And I am conducting 350 interviews with the help of a fabulous research assistant who's in urban planning here, and as a research assistant who's located at HOMA among the 6 different districts. And we're comparing the differences in subsistence activities and knowledge passed. Phase 2 is to develop a community-based adaptation. And so the first way is a grant that I've applied to for an NIMHD called Returning to Our Roots, which is a youth reconnection to traditional ways intervention, and then a grant that's been received but not announced, so you don't know this, a grant from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine for a $2.1 million grant to look at culture, climate, movement, and how United Homa Nation members navigate decision-making in a shifting landscape. And so in there, I apologize if I've gone over a little bit, but I do have to also thank my mentors and all the funders that have helped me along the way. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you to our panelists. I first wanted to open up any questions from members of the audience. If you have any questions you'd like to ask Shanondora, Jaskaran, or Sam, I'm just going to go on first name basis now. Please, I'll open it up, and if not, I'm happy to ask kind of the first round of questions. So, yes, in the back.
I wanted to ask if you could provide some examples of resources to women of the countervailing collective power that was talked about in democracy. If you see some examples where that is actually being practiced and implemented.
So I think the larger question was concrete examples of countervailing kind of organization that was discussed in the democracy talk. And sorry, who was Jaskaran or Shanondora or both? Okay.
Thanks for the question. I think that the one thing I can say in response to that is I have been incredibly humbled and inspired by the amount of youth organizing I have seen in various locations around the globe that are really sort of, I think, markers of a kind of architecture of resistance that we haven't seen before, at least I haven't seen before in my lifetime. So these are young people that I've been working with in the northeastern section of Cambodia, also Indigenous, also started to document this in India, obviously spent a great deal of time at Standing Rock. So this is kind of a global configuration of anti-colonial resistance that is mounting against extractivism and sort of racialized capitalism across various parts of the planet. And I could say a lot about each of those individual kind of sites as a site of resistance, but I will say that there are deep challenges to the bounds of what the state has both offered and will offer in terms of altering the circumstances of environmental devastation. And I had the great privilege a few weeks ago of interviewing some amazing youth climate strike organizers in Philadelphia, where I live, and the leaders of the Pennsylvania Youth Climate Strike. The leader is a young woman whose parents are from Bangladesh, and then I interviewed some of her comrades too who are a part of that, and their sort of very clear and articulate political analysis that is deeply intellectually grounded, that knows the climate science is very, very impressive. So their ability to sort of understand climate change as an internationalist project, to critique the United States' role in the production of the problem of climate change and environmental justice worldwide, to think about the responsibility they have to the Black communities in their city that have been deeply impacted by environmental devastation through now just approved in July, another $60 million LNG plant next to the South Philadelphia neighborhoods that have been experiencing pollution and environmental devastation forever. So when I'm sort of feeling desperate for some kind of like glimpse into the future that does not look like gloom, I look to young people who are not part of formal political organizations, but are actually forming their own ways of thinking about what it means to resist in this moment.
So, yeah. Thank you for the question. So one example that I can think of within my own community is resistance through language. So as I mentioned, a lot of cultural knowledge is being lost, and to that extent, language, our original language, was lost. And there's a huge movement among the youth, which I say youth, but they're really like 30 and younger, who have taken over language revitalization projects, and teaching their children, but also advocating for the language to be accepted and taught in the elementary schools.
Normally, no, I don't. So I was curious about it. Who decides? I don't understand to what benefit knowing who decides gives anyone. Is the person or the group that decides the group that then gets funding you got, or given some kind of power? What is the origins of this question? Because normally who decides is an important question, but I can't see in the case of sustainability justice that there's any kudo to being the group that decides.
Come on, theorist.
Is this on? No?
Here.
Yes? Okay, great. Yeah, so I think that the question comes out of there being a lot of the way that we define, I think, our concepts, and this is what I try to do. The way that we define our concepts has a lot to do with then how we put them into practice. So, the project that I was presenting on is, the way that we define democracy and the goals that we have in doing democracy is going to influence quite a bit how then we try to implement it, and then whether it's able to be it's going to affect who it serves, basically. So I think the same is true of the concept of sustainability justice, right? If the idea, or environmental justice, if the people who are deciding what environmental justice or sustainability justice is, well, depending on who they are, they're going to have a different set of concerns in setting forth that definition, and then that definition will have implications down the line for how people try to implement sustainability justice. And so the kinds of programs that I was talking about in my presentation that are, if sustainability justice is defines to mean a certain kind of somewhat superficial inclusion in processes of participation, like, oh, well, sustainability justice means including people in this process, which is sort of already a foregone conclusion that there's going to be this process of dispossession and development and building on land and continuing sort of capitalist accumulation, right? If that's sort of all taken for granted before you even start, then that definition of sustainability justice there are other versions of sustainability justice where those things aren't taken for granted, right? And so I think that's why I think it matters
Okay,
who decides, yeah.
Then I would ask you, if you're talking about, why not say who's talking? Who's talking?
Yeah, maybe
What's the
that's
narrative?
another way of saying that the question. Yeah, I think.
I don't think it's just about who's talking, though. I think it's also about who has power, right? Who sets the terms of the game, right? How do we think about what the terms of the game are, and who has the ability to exercise power to enforce those terms of the game, right? So I think, what you're sort of speaking to around how do you construct the problem? The construction of the problem determines the kind of solutions that you propose, right? So my students at the New School they're all like, they're gung-ho about becoming activists. They want to learn social and political theory so that they can be better organizers. And I always stop them at the beginning in the introductory undergraduate classes I talk, and I ask them to think about how the problems become constructed, right? So who holds power to be able to construct and frame a problem sets the terms of the game, and everything else follows after that.
I would add to that it also sets the terms of what the solutions can be and what knowledge is held important to be able to address those solutions. Yeah, that's great.
Yes, the last speaker had a note on there that caught my attention. Preserve the sovereignty of the tribe. And that rang a bell because there are a lot of countries in the world today that are progressive and they are civilized and they're run by family tribes. You don't need a lawyer. If you have a problem, you go to your tribe leader, and that tribe leader goes to the other tribe leader and negotiates a settlement for your dispute. I'm just curious whether our gentleman from Oxford has studied this idea of tribal, trying to get families to give up their rules. Must not be easy, but somehow we did it here in the U.S. And yet I see it successfully being implemented around the world. That the tribes have their sovereignty, which is what caught my attention on that last slide.
Yeah, I think I'd have to know a bit more about what sorts of forms of organization you're talking about in order to know how to address that. Yeah.
Well, the country of Jordan is one. It's a kingdom, but it's run by the tribes or the family.
Right.
Very well.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. Thanks.
Speaking to Dr. Dillon and Dr. Billiot, how can we as kind of outsiders and maybe as people in like a place of privilege in society, respectfully learn from and work with Indigenous people in this process?
So one of the ways that I try to teach my students in social work is that first off, you meet the client, the community member, where they are. And just like this question of power that where they are is not below you, or that your knowledge is above theirs. So that's just one kind of mindset to go into. But there's also this, I think that there's this idea that of space, of how much space that you take with you into a community of privilege. like that, are your, how much space you take your privilege with you into a vulnerable community. So even though I was working with my own community, I haven't been there since I was 18, and I'd also been away to college, and so I was viewed very differently. And so just reminding myself, they don't still see me as a 12-year-old girl jumping in the bayou. I have to like put myself in how they see me from their eyes to be able to communicate effectively. Is that, okay. Yep. A good enough example? Yeah.
So I will say, I'll speak from my vantage point as the daughter of immigrants that grew up in, Cree territory and had to think a lot about what that meant as somebody that's committed to a larger political project of decolonization. And I would say that part of it is knowing your own history and understanding the place in which you live and that you reside and knowing the history of the peoples of that territory. And that takes time for people to understand, and also the sort of unraveling of settler colonial history for people can be a difficult and time-consuming process, but I think it's an essential one to understand how you relate to communities that are attempting to resist and survive and advance a political project that is central to who they are, right? And these countries exist because of the history of slavery and Indigenous genocide and dispossession. That's actually how they came into being. So you have to be honest about your relationship to that territory. And I would also say, and I say this to my students and other comrades that ask me this question often, is this kind of work requires the development of relationships, which I think that you just gestured to, like some of the things that you have to do to actually build relationships with people. And relationships require a kind of commitment and a responsibility to community, and also a kind of a commitment over a period of time, right? So, and also knowing sort of how you relate to that community comes from the process of building relationships, right? So I undertook the work for my first book, primarily because Cree youth workers and other social workers kept confronting these problems in the way that programs were being designed for Indigenous young people who were incarcerated, who were dealing with police brutality, and that emerged from those relationships. How I chose to conduct my research is part of how you build relationships, right? It's kind of central. And there's some really good writing about this by Kim Tallbear, Linda Tyway Smith, like others, that really amazing Indigenous feminists that do this work too.
I also want to add one other thing, is that that while I'm the person who's I'm applying for grants, it's really the community's knowledge, and I'm sharing their knowledge, and they're leading the efforts. So the ideas of these interventions, these community-based adaptations, were derived from them. And I'm just kind of like a person that is in the community, trying to, connect one person to another, or in this sense, academia with the community. So I never view myself as a leader or anybody who's these are my ideas, because they're not. It's their expert knowledge.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If anybody, yeah.
Thank you. These were very informative. I have a question for Dr. Dillon and maybe Dr. Bagg. I'm completely with you on the decolonial stuff, but excuse my cynicism, when you see Bolsonaro and all the new authoritarian leaders, like where I'm from in Eastern Europe, using this decolonial, post-colonial language to talk about this is our forest, this is our nation. I mean, what are the limits of that perspective? Because I remember 25 years ago, that's exactly what we said against this globalist, environmentalist, conservationist agenda, that the Amazon doesn't belong to humanity. And now when Bolsonaro says the same thing, it belongs to Brazil, our nation, then it's suddenly ideologically suspect, rightly so. So I just want to see how you theorize those distinctions.
I'll just say first that you can twist any concept or any language to serve your ends. And I think it's clear that that's what he's doing. I think Bolsonaro doesn't, I mean, that's not close to what decolonization really means. So I think there's no way to prevent people from taking up concepts and using them in ways that they that have no relationship to what the people who invented them meant by them. I think we do have some responsibility to think about the life of our concepts in the world, and that's, I mean, in a sense, that's what I'm doing with trying to think about democracy in terms of dispersing power instead of collective self-rule. I think it will actually help to think about it one way rather than the other, and that thinking about it one way will have certain kinds of consequences rather than thinking about it in another way. But you can't, I mean, there's always going to be people who twist those concepts, and it's hard to prevent that. But maybe Jaskaran can say more about her understanding of what decolonization really does mean.
So I think part of my response to that is, I think, similar, right? There's a long history of co-optation, of appropriation, of a certain kind of discourse and way of thinking about social transformation and change. But I think the propaganda, if I can use that language, has its limits, because people act and people always resist. So some of what you see in the process of decolonization is actually in the actions of people. So when you look at the mass mobilizations around the burning of the Amazon, you look at the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, or the rubber plantations, or the damming in India, or any other place, like, you see how people actually live the process of decolonization, which is land reclamation, which is language revitalization, it's resistance to extractive projects that take various kinds, it's the establishment of schools that do the work of political education. And so I think that there are moments in time where you see this kind of, I mean, and look at Justin Trudeau in Canada, where I grew up, right? The sort of picture perfect, quote unquote, multicultural leader, and ensconced in the politics of recognition in Canada, right? And also, has a very, very different, and has an underside. I'll just say that, right? Like has multiple faces, apparently. Yeah, right, pun intended. So I think that we write, we resist, we speak, always in opposition to co-optation and appropriation, and people mobilize and resist in the face of that all the time. So I think we just have to continue to do that work, right? And lots of people are thinking about these things, and there are, we have I will also say this, the US state is not an exceptional state. There are very long histories of social movements in the global south, of organizing, that we can draw on long traditions of resistance that actually help us understand where we're at, and also help us, carve our pathway forward.
Thank you to our audience, and thank you to our panelists. And